Hello, it's Julesy, and I am supremely excited to be launching this series, Focus on the State. 2020 has already proven itself to be an exhaustive year. The built-up frustrations that have peaked around the police brutality against the Black community are not at all comforted or assuaged with the idea that in November of 2020, we will be voting between two old white men. And it is very kind of me to leave it at that. But yes, we know 2020 is an election year, and more than just the presidency is at stake. I absolutely understand being wary of the presidential election, and every 4 years, suddenly hearing about the things this one person can potentially change. And for many of us, we don't really see the crucial benefits promised to us because the politics that impact us the most are our state and local politics. And so in this series, Focus on the States walks you through the pertinence of what's happening on the state, county, and local level, and that will address many of our concerns that have become national boiling points in the past week. In this interview, I sit down with New York Times political reporter Astead Herndon, who has covered the state electorates that sway the presidential primaries. A super insightful interview. Astead really expanded the way I think about my state politics and how they impact our ability to see progressive candidates on the federal level. His insight on how we view the Black vote and the subconscious bias towards southern states where most of the Black population resides is invaluable. And I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Thank you to all my supporters on Patreon for making this series possible. I hope you enjoy this interview. Okay, I have Astead Herndon, who is a national politics reporter for the New York Times, and we are going to discuss, my favorite thing, state politics, because we are focusing on the state. And I'm really grateful to have you here, so thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And we're just going to get right into the questions. I'm going to turn my volume up a little bit more and start this off, all right? So I live in North Carolina, and the way that, I've been following you for a while, but what really kind of piqued my interest is I listen to the New York Times, the daily podcast every morning. I literally say, hey, Google, good morning, and it plays the podcast for me. And so you've been on quite a few episodes this past election cycle, but in particular, your coverage of what was happening in Wisconsin and their state legislator versus governor. What really intrigued me is because I live in North Carolina, it sounds a lot similar to what's happening here in North Carolina. And as the GOP battles to maintain control of the government, are there any other states on a similar pathway?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of states that are actually on this pathway. When you think about Wisconsin and North Carolina, one of the things they have in common is that they were those battleground purple states that really helped decide the presidential election. And so those states have often become the laboratories for kind of the partisan fighting we see on the national level. It plays out on the state level because it's so neck and neck. And so in the Wisconsins, in the Michigans, in the North Carolinas, in the Georgias, we've seen the state legislature be a real laboratory for conservative ideas because Republicans have been able to take control of those state legislatures. And so in Wisconsin, what we saw was a state legislature that refused to change the election date, even though the coronavirus pandemic had really made in-person voting very kind of public health unsafe. And they did so over the concerns of the Democratic governor. In North Carolina, I know you all have had similar fighting from a state legislator to a Democratic governor. And these are all mostly because these Democratic governors are new and they oftentimes don't have the state legislature backing. And so a way to compare it is like, obviously, if the president didn't have control of the Congress, what would they be able to do? And a lot of times that's limited by that kind of bickering back and forth. And that's what we've seen in Wisconsin. That's what we've seen in North Carolina and a bunch of those battleground states. That's kind of the modus operandi, the natural state of play to how they work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And both North Carolina and Wisconsin held special sessions after the election of Democrat governors. So I know we're seeing the impact come around this election cycle, but when North Carolina was in 2018, I believe Wisconsin was last year or 2018 as well.
2018 also.
Okay. And, both special sessions, they moved to strip the power from the incoming governor. So can you discuss more the impact of these special sessions have?
Yeah, it was a pretty kind of overt power play by those Republican legislators we're talking about. So, right after Democrats experienced big wins in states in 2018, being able to take back governorships in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and maintain it in North Carolina, the state representatives and senators decided to hold a special session which would actually impact the incoming governor's powers. And so in Wisconsin, which is the one that comes most to mind because I was just thinking about it, they limited the ability for the governor to act on guns, to work in for the attorney general's ability to act in court cases, and strip some of the powers from an education board. Now, these are all things that were available to the Republican governor before Scott Walker in Wisconsin. But when the Democrat was coming in, the Republicans moved quickly to say, oh, we should limit these powers. This is because they feel kind of insulated from the political resolve. They think that they're kind of untouchable because of the way the maps are drawn and other things. And they really don't see that kind of close Democratic victory of the governorship as a rejection of them. They feel kind of emboldened and brazen to buck up their powers and to really push back against that Democratic governor. In a lot of instances, some of these Republican legislators don't see the Democratic governors as really legitimate actors, and that kind of creates this real tension.
And is there some sort of belief maybe that by the Republican Party that, well, the average constituent isn't really paying attention to their state legislator, so they can kind of move more overtly in these spaces and face a lot less pushback? Or consequential pushback, at least?
Yeah, there's some of it. There's a lot of things working together. I mean, it's just true that state legislators, state Senate races are less. There's less turnout for those. And so the people who are usually really deeply invested in them are very, what we call partisan. So hardcore Republicans or hardcore Democrats. And so that's usually the people who come out to these elections. And so that looks very different than even a congressional election. And that looks very different than the presidential election. And so when you have more and more people participate, the swath and the diversity of the people who come out is different. And these local elections, it's oftentimes the most committed, the most hardened. And that gives these legislators a little bit of leeway. They think, oh, well, if the most committed people are the ones focusing my actions, that's who I should play towards. That's who I should legislate in their interest. But there's also one of the things that state legislatures get to do is draw the maps for the state. And that's a real sense of power. And so this is where we hear terms like gerrymandering, because they're able to draw maps that actually, and this is Democrats and Republicans, that actually give them sometimes a scientifically guaranteed electorate that works in their interest. And so there's ways that they've been able to move both Congress and local elections to kind of hone their power. And that's why you see a real sense of boldness oftentimes from state legislators, because the attitude is, I don't think I can be beaten. And in some cases, they're right.
Yeah, this definitely came up when I was talking to my state senator, Jeff Jackson, because North Carolina is currently going through, at least within the state courts, a battle over the congressional map. So we currently have a map this next election cycle that'll be in place, and then it'll be replaced come January.
Exactly.
And he's talked about how much power that really allows them. And as you mentioned, it also impacts how Congress is formed. So I want to take it back to 2010 with the REDMAP project instituted by the Republican State Leadership Committee, which stands for Redistricting Majority Project, in which the GOP focused on swing states that were turning blue. So at the time, and these are mostly even to this day, current battleground states. So it'd be Pennsylvania, Ohio, states you mentioned earlier, Michigan, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. And their focus was to swing these state governments in their favor. So I guess, we're going to keep going over this kind of same idea, but can you speak to the implication of that effort and how it impacts presidential elections?
Oh, for sure. So, I mean, after Barack Obama won in 2008, there was a kind of effort that I think for many Democrats was underrated by Republicans. Of course, Republicans had big gains in 2012 and 2010 that were helped them to be able to push back against Barack Obama in Washington. But what you're talking about was a state effort that Republicans undertook that really said that the places where we think we can build power going forward are going to be in these local election fights. And so it used the energy of the Tea Party, it used the energy of the Barack Obama backlash to really be able to win a lot of these districts. And so when you have, for Democrats in the Obama era, so when you go from 2008 to 2016, they were wiped out in these state legislatures. They were wiped out in these governorships. And so by the time you have the 2016 election, Republicans have gained a real sense of grassroots power in these state houses. And so to your question of impact and what that means for the presidential level, it, one, gives them that power to draw maps. So so every 10 years you have the census. 2020 and obviously 2010 was the last year. And the legislature that's in power after the census is done gets to draw the maps and has that power. And that gets you a kind of 10-year head start for the next one. So if you're able to draw the maps and you're able to build in an advantage for your party, the next time the next party can reverse that is 10 years from now. And by that time, the landscape looks completely different. So 2020, this next census time, the landscape already looks very different from 2010. And Republicans saw real success in that kind of 2010, 2012 wave. And they were able to build on that. Obviously, by the time Barack Obama is leaving office, you have a Republican House and a Republican Senate, right? But more importantly, you have governorships that impact things like voting laws, that impact things like state judiciaries and state Supreme Court seats. And so Republicans were able to build this real base of power that Trump is now capitalizing off of, but really started with the effort you mentioned in 2010 and much even while there was a Democratic president.
Can you break down the line between state politics and the vice president selection, which is a really popular conversation, and you've been doing quite a bit of coverage over Stacey Abrams, Kamala Harris, and some of the other candidates whose names have come up. So can you talk about that specifically with regards to who Biden might be selecting?
It's funny because there's actually a lot of mixed evidence and not very clear that who the nominee selects changes the map for November. So we're really dealing here in a perception game, in a kind of guessing game that we think impacts, it might impact, but it's not very clear that if someone selects someone from, let's say, Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota, that means that there will be a change in the way people vote in Minnesota. We have a lot of examples of this. Mitt Romney selected Paul Ryan in Wisconsin, and that didn't lead to Barack Obama losing in Wisconsin. You can go back historically, and that's kind of an open question. But for this year, there is a lot of ways that the state that the options come from impacts whether or not they'll be selected. So take someone like Stacey Abrams. Georgia is thought to be a state that is a possibility for Democrats in the future, that the growing minority population and the way that some white Southerners have really moved, like kind of suburban Southerner has moved away from the Republican Party under Trump. There's some feeling that Georgia could be an option for them. Now, would bringing someone from Georgia onto the ticket help that equation? If they might. Or think about someone to go to a different state issue, like Elizabeth Warren being selected for Massachusetts. Now, of course, Massachusetts is a deeply blue state, but what you do have is if she's selected and has a Republican governor, will that Republican governor choose another Republican and then change the makeup of the Senate? And so some of those things that we're thinking about when we talk about the vice presidential selections really are a matter of where they come from in that state level. Someone like Kamala Harris, you might think, well, California is definitely going to vote for Joe Biden. And that's almost 1,000% correct. What California has is really the ATM of the Democratic Party, the richest donors. And does selecting someone like Kamala Harris allow Joe Biden to tap into more money than he would have if he would select someone else. And so those are the kind of options. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan is another person who that state level impact is really important. Those are the type of things he's weighing. We don't know for sure where their heads are at in terms of what outweighs more than the other, the experience question versus the state versus how much they appeal to black voters versus how much they appeal to progressives. All of these things are kind of a puzzle that they're going to put together. What we do know from Biden is that he has always said his number one criteria is, do we get along and how well we get along? And because he really sees that his relationship with Barack Obama was built on mutual trust. And so that's the other thing. Some of this is just whether they hit it off when they sit down together.
You know, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought a whole lot I hadn't thought about Elizabeth Warren as a VP pick at all because her history with the Obama administration doesn't really leave positive, taste on the side of the Obama administration because she had that whole fallout with the Secretary of Treasury under Obama. I hadn't really thought about, okay, well, if they pick someone from the state level, right, who the governor is and what the state legislator looks like and what the rules are around their replacement. So like in North Carolina, if there was anybody who was viable, right, as a pick for vice president, the Democrat governor doesn't necessarily get to instill or replace them with another Democrat because the state legislator passed the bill in 2018 saying that they had to pick from 3 candidates that the GOP or whatever majority party of the state leg pick. So, there's all the ways in which this kind of the web tangles out to impact all levels of our government.
Exactly, and that's a huge point. And so what we could see, and you're certainly correct about how Warren left with the certain parts, especially the economic parts of the Obama administration. But the thing that some Biden people like, and certainly she's on a longer list, so this is not saying she's going to be chosen, but what some Biden people like is to say, hey, Biden has struggled with younger voters, has struggled with progressive voters, and maybe bringing someone on that has governing credentials with them breaks a unified ticket. But even if you don't take Warren, even if you take someone like, there's just a number of senators, right? So we have Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota. At the minimum, you're going to have a special election to replace them. And that's something that sometimes Democrats have lost. Think back to, they lost one in Massachusetts after Ted Kennedy died. But at the best, Warren would need the state legislators in Massachusetts who have a supermajority to pass a law saying the governor needs to defer to the state legislature when he's choosing a Senate pick. That's something that could be done, but it's certainly not a given. And that is one of the big questions we're going to have depending on who he selects.
But do you really want to play the game the GOP is playing, right? Because that could backfire on them if they ever were to lose a supermajority. And you have this law in the book that says whoever the party and the power of the state legislator is, you have to pick from their cauldron of candidates in order to replace a senator.
Exactly. I mean, that's going to be something they have to negotiate. I mean, Democrats would sometimes say the opposite, that they have let the Republicans do these power plays and they have been too unwilling to do some of those to make what they want to happen. But of course, none of this is guaranteed, and some of this sometimes backfires. And so does Biden want to wade into that? Does Biden want to avoid all that altogether? And, choose Kamala Harris, choose someone who, wouldn't have those type of questions. If someone leaves the California Senate, it's going to be a Democrat that replaces them. And that's not a question. And so those are all of the things that this kind of committee and the vice president are going to have to take into account.
All right, let's bring it back to the South. Because the South gets thrown under the bus so much as if it's an unchangeable region of the United States, but it's also still consistently where most of the African American community statistically resides. So in Louisiana, a deep red state, they elected a Democrat governor, John Bel-Edwards. Was there anything in particular unique about this election?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've seen both, and in the re-election, this is a pro-life Democrat. This is someone who has taken some what we would call socially conservative stances, and that is kind of the question that Democrats are going to have to answer when they want to take power back in different regions, particularly the South. What is the tent going to look like? And one of the things that Louisiana really has succeeded in is the entire party rallying around a Democrat who really is a local Democrat, can win in the state. But if he had these stances in the presidential election, obviously that wouldn't go anywhere. You can't be a pro-life Democrat running on a kind of national stage. But that is something that these Democrats have been willing to a negotiation they've been willing to have to really take party back on the statewide level. And frankly, it's allowed them to get things done in Louisiana that they would not have otherwise. This is someone who, even with Trump weighing in, won re-election again this year. And so that's a kind of power building. It's still an open question. You have a kind of Stacey Abrams model, right? That like kind of not compromise, change the electorate in terms of a grassroots effort. That was kind of something that kind of Beto O'Rourke or Andrew Gillum was trying to do in Florida. But John Bel-Edwards in Louisiana represents a different type of option. Andy Beshear, who won in Kentucky, that governor's race, represents a kind of different type of option, which is if you can motivate kind of Democratic constituencies to a certain level, or maybe that anti-Trumpness motivates them. And you can provide someone who is palatable to former Republicans or to centrists, then you can create a kind of winning coalition among that smaller electorate. So will Democrats win Louisiana or Kentucky in the presidential election? Almost absolutely not, right? But these are among that smaller group. You can have someone who can create credentials locally to still be able to win in the state. And it works in the opposite too. Massachusetts, Vermont have these Republican governors who would not work well in the National Republican Party. Maryland's governor would not work well in the National Republican Party, but they've been able to create a niche for themselves locally. And that is the type of thing that, particularly in the South, if Democrats want to do statewide efforts better. Obviously, a great example was in the Georgia Senate race, Doug Jones, right? If Democrats want those type of wins, you gotta have someone who works for the state.
That's something we definitely have to think about, I think, because a lot of us are on social media now. We tend to want to push our politics or no politics. And I don't ever want to counter or tell someone that they can't do that. But especially when we're talking about states where we don't currently reside and looking at the uniqueness of how that state politics are made and what people have to negotiate to sustain themselves, that we should be more considerate of what they're dealing with. And part of that for me is that when we talk about the sort of hopelessness or perceived hopelessness of someplace like Louisiana or a Mississippi and claiming that they have backward politics, I feel like that sort of rhetoric overlooks the long history of activism that has come out of the communities that are local to those states. So can you speak to some of the current politics? We talked about Louisiana, but is anything currently happening on the ground at Mississippi?
Now, I mean, I think about, to your point, how the broad strokes of people who dismiss the South as some place, I heard this a lot during the presidential election. Oh, why does it matter who these states are voting for? They're not going to be states that Democrats win in the general. And to your point, these are people who have kind of built the grassroots efforts for Democratic communities, who are among the most vulnerable populations, who are disproportionately the people of color who anchor the Democratic Party nationwide. And so to hear people kind of outright dismiss them, I think has always been a kind of a tell that they really don't understand the kind of grassroots efforts that have really kicked off things nationally. Now, in Mississippi, I'm trying to think, I was recently talking with Mayor Lumumba in Jackson, who has been a kind of progressive champion on the local level, and someone who thought could make a kind of more national or has a future in the South. A young mayor, someone who's kind of embraced a leftist criminal justice platform. And I remember recently he won a big settlement to be able to get back money from the city from an environmental pollution effort that really ravaged the state or ravaged the community. And I think about those type of mayors. So in Birmingham, you have Randall Woodfin. In the South, in Columbia, you have Stephen Benjamin. And these are places that may not be the Atlantas, that may not be the kind of biggest communities, but you're starting to see in the kind of historic South, and those, and even in the blue dots in those red states, a real kind of power base of grassroots efforts being created. These are all young mayors. These are all people who embrace a type of rhetoric that would be seen as more radical if you think about the landscape of the South. But this is where those kind of political movements are building. And when you talk to each one of them on how they won, I think is the interesting part, because it embraces the kind of, we have to reach everyone, we have to touch everyone, and we're not going to put any voter aside. And we're not going to compromise our kind of like core values and beliefs. And so to have this kind of crop of young electeds who are very explicit about what they believe about racial justice in the South, and to see the kind of political electoral basis they're building, to me, is one of the things that Democrats have been asking for, right? Have been looking for in terms of building in the South. It is up to the national party. It is up to kind of top down to really elevate those efforts. And to make them go the next level, not just from Democratic basis, but to statewide basis.
Yeah, there is. I live maybe 20 minutes from South Carolina, and South Carolina is a very hectic state during the presidential election. They get a ton of attention. So it's always interesting that we have this sort of, I don't know, is it a national opinion that the South is so behind, but you have, you know, a southern state that has a long history with slavery, a very particular history, around the same things that we would use to dismiss in Mississippi, that is very pivotal in how the presidential election is run.
Yeah, and we think about what South Carolina did in this cycle, it changed the whole trajectory. I mean, I spent a lot of time in South Carolina over the past year, and one of the things that was so clear was the diversity of Black voter even within that state. I mean, what makes that state important isn't just that it's, 50-60% Black people. It's that you have kind of rural Black people who could be indicative of where some folks will go in the South. You have your Columbias and Charlestons. You have a big slate of HBCUs. I mean, you have a kind of a microcosm of what is a different Southern Black electorate. And for the Democratic primary, it's historically been, if you can't appeal to that swath of people, your chances are fairly low. And what we saw this cycle was that it completely swung the direction of what was to happen next. And, sometimes you would feel people try to psych themselves out to we call it 5D chess, where they will game out how you could win without Black people in the Democratic primary. And it was always very clear, the person who had the most support there, and if that support stayed consistent, you always have an inside track, no matter what happens in Iowa, no matter what happens in New Hampshire. And I think one of the things we saw this cycle is that the kind of false belief that what happened in Iowa and New Hampshire would change Black folks' minds as if they were looking to them for their political support was really a false one. And it really played out this cycle when you had people really just say, you know what happened in those last states? We're going to do something different here. And then that predicted Super Tuesday, not the states before it.
It was a game changer. Okay, we're going to switch the topic a little bit, because last year you covered how Minnesota, which has a considerable Somali refugee community, in particular to the town of St. Cloud, was seeing white anti-immigrant activists press for an explicit anti-Muslim agenda. So can we discuss, or can you speak to how local government can be used in the modern era to suppress communities?
Yeah, I mean, that was, when we talk about local efforts, I mean, one of the things we started off with last year is I wanted to write about white identity and how kind of explicit appeals to whiteness was playing out. But we wanted to do it on a local effort, because sometimes when people, I think sometimes when we wrap this up in Washington, people already have such baked in opinions about who these people are, what they mean, that you don't actually get to see it as a news story. And so one of the reasons I went to St. Cloud is that Minnesota I knew Minnesota was a really interesting state, right? You have a huge refugee population, the biggest Somali refugee population in the country. And then you also had a real clash with kind of the other regions of the state, which were kind of moving in a anti-immigrant direction on the conservative side.
I do want to interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
Can we just particular to the YouTube space, can we, I want to distinguish why we're saying Somali refugee and not simply just a Somali community. I don't know that my audience understands the particulars of how immigration in the United States works.
Yeah.
And that there's a different process for someone. I don't know what the technical terms are, but if you come through as a refugee, there's just different politics and different economics that impact that community versus if you immigrate, I don't know, on like a college visa or the. the other means of immigration.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. This is not, I mean, to use the terms that our White House uses, which is obviously wrapped up in all of other things. This is not kind of merit based. This is not the kind of visas we see that allows kind of people who come and have situations that are educational or economic. These are usually people who are fleeing war-torn countries, particularly in Somalia, and who have a kind of sponsor that allows them to come here, but are usually doing so. Oh, sorry, there's a loud truck outside. They're usually doing so in pretty economically desperate situations. In St. Cloud, what you had was an influx of immigrants that was undeniable. They were not imagining the changing demographics of their community. It was changing. And what you had, though, was a white political structure, so a city council and a mayor who were really tasked with pressure from their local constituents to do something about it, in quotes. And what they decided to do was, after several really contentious meetings among where they were wearing hats that said, make St. Cloud great again and the like, they were decided to try to institute a ban on new refugees. Now, they did it under the guise of an economic study. So they were saying, until we learn the economic impact that these communities are having, we shouldn't have more. But one of the things that I did in going there was really push them on that question. And what you would see is that it wasn't really tied to economics at all. They truly believed that there was a cultural conflict, that there was an incompatibility with Muslim refugees and what they saw as their community. And so, one of the things we had in that story was a quote from a woman saying, if they came from Norway, I would be fine with it. Right. And so that's a pretty explicit articulation of what we know as the delineating lines, that it wasn't actually about that it was immigrants. Right. It wasn't just general immigrants. It was who these immigrants were and what they looked like that really changed the community. And so that measure, the measure to ban refugees was struck down, but the kind of conflict hasn't stopped. So even after the story came out, there was a big community meeting. There was a real kind of pushback where the state came in and tried to kind of talk down tensions. But these aren't things that are solved overnight. What the kind of immigrant community says is they want a kind of top-down effort to build economic sustainability and inclusiveness. And until that happens, there's still going to be those small-scale clashes, because there was a group called Concerned Community Citizens, or they called themselves, and they would meet in the church. I went to their meeting on one day, and they were saying how the community was unrecognizable, and all these anecdotes about crime. And it's that type of misinformation, that type of information that's overlapped with kind of racist and anti-immigrant sentiment that allows these things to persist.
So how can one educate themselves on local politics? And I wanted to ask this question specifically because there's been a demise in local newspapers. Mm-hmm. So for someone, if their story's not getting covered in the New York Times just yet, do you have any suggestions on how people can further educate themselves on what's happening locally?
Yeah, I mean, I would still say start with that local newspaper. I mean, I know that they have taken a big hit, but in North Carolina, y'all are lucky to have some good ones left. And I know the political reporters out, the Charlotte Observer and the like, and those are hardworking folks. I mean, in South Carolina, you have the State, you have all of those places have are still good starting points for coverage. I think there's places like we are in a new media age, and so I would encourage people to seek out voices that they find as interesting, whether that is on YouTube like yourself or on Twitter or on the others, that are providing kind of fact-based information. And then also the whole local media ecosystem. So that could be television, that could be, I think of I have a friend who works at the Charlotte Agenda, which I think is like a new outlet that's like trying to like tell kind of news stories. And I think that there is a lot of those popping up throughout the country and that are trying to service local communities. And then I would also shout out like minority press in a lot of these places. And so there are also ones that have taken a big hit. But I know I'm from Chicago suburbs, and I remember the early stories I always read were in the Chicago Defender, along with the Chicago Tribune. And those places, to the extent in which they still are up and running, are still kind of good coverage drivers for what's happening on the ground. We talk about the South Carolina primary. I think there was a lot of stuff that the kind of local minority press was able to highlight or to push candidates on that maybe some other places missed. And so, I know while the premise is true about local news decline, I would still think that it is the first and most important source to start with. But, I think, there remains different outlets that with effort and time, I know that you can seek out voices that will provide the information you're looking for.
Do you have any suggestions for how individuals, such as people in my audience, can be more involved in their state government?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't have any suggestions that are outside the normal. So I think that find a politician you connect with, find a political media or an event or a group that you can volunteer with, a cause. I think the good thing about local and state government is that it's not too big to tell anybody no. And so if you want to get involved, if you want to call someone up, if you want to reach out, you can usually find those places and outlets to do something. I think about this in terms of local media. There's a real ability to get face to face, or not now, but before that, you get face to face with your elected officials and be able to ask them questions and to be able to get real answers. And I think that that's the real promise of like starting out and caring about local and state news, is that if you want to ask if you want to get your state senator on Skype, you can. And so I think that there is I don't have any suggestions outside of the kind of typical things, but I would say that if you are persistent and if you are dedicated to it, there is an undeniable impact and space that you can operate in, because frankly, these places are looking for interested and involved people. And it's not the ground isn't saturated like a presidential candidate who's got all these handlers and you can't talk to them without going through 6 people. If you want to ask a question of your mayor, of your city councilor, of your state senator or state rep, those are things you can do. And I think it's a really good way to get involved and to get a kind of baseline understanding of the way things work.
Yeah, I mean, I know I have a certain amount of influence, so my ability to get in touch with my...
I wasn't trying to demonize.
No, I'm not saying you, because I move a lot. So I lived in New York for 8 years, and I went back home to Delaware for a little bit, and I went back to DC, which is where I went to college, and then Houston, Dallas, and now Charlotte.
Oh, wow.
And I've done all that since 2013, so in the past 7 years. So everywhere that I've lived, since I've left New York, I've reached out to my local elected officials. And so it's like, I have the YouTube channel, so having an audience does help. But particular to like being able to reach my state senator, he's on Twitter. And I even found out about him because he was doing an event in front of Dairy Queen. And so a lot of local politicians are actually trying to drum up being able to engage with their constituents. So in Dallas, I didn't really have that easy of a time, but I found that there might be maybe not my politicians from my district, but neighboring districts might be more responsive or be doing more outreach. So it might not always be the person who directly governs where you live, but it might be someone adjacent to the county that you live in who would be willing to engage and then help you get your foot into understanding, how the state, what's going on in the state and where you can involve yourself. Okay, so my last question is there anything happening on the state level that's currently you find interesting or that has piqued your interest?
Yeah, I mean, there's still some primaries left. And so while the presidential primary is over, there's a couple interesting congressional primaries that are still happening in New York, where I live. There's still a number of congressional battles between kind of progressive left-wing candidates and incumbents that are still left to play out. And then there's a couple of ones throughout the country that we're looking at. So Rashida Tlaib in Michigan has a primary challenge that's going to be tough. That will be a key one to look for in Michigan. One of the impacts of the kind of pandemic in this moment is it's kind of caused people to rally around their incumbents and rally around the people who are in office, because leaders have been able to show themselves as stepping up for their community. And so places like the North Carolina race that's happening in November have been kind of reshaped by the idea, by the fact that people just like their governors right now. They like the person who they see on TV every day telling them that things are going to be safe. And so we're still tracking how those impacts affect what might be in November. But I think in the immediate, there's still a couple of primaries congressional primaries that we find pretty interesting. But we're kind of in a lull a little bit because we've seen kind of the biggest chunks already happen. And it's a little before we get into full general election swing. But there's like 2 or 3 left that are still going to be good.
Yeah, in North Carolina, we do have a Senate race. I'm not worried about the governor, but we have.
Yeah, there's an important Senate race. But that's going to be, when you look at the Senate map across the country, South Carolina, North Carolina are really on the forefront of what's going to be Democratic efforts to take back the Senate. And so, North Carolina has been good for Democrats recently. Whether this will be the kind of next step there. And then you have South Carolina and Jamie Harrison and Lindsey Graham. You have Georgia races. You have the Arizona the Arizona Senate race. So the Senate, I think we think so much about the presidential race that we kind of forget that both Democrats took the House, but those seats are not guaranteed. They still have to win those back. And then, of course, the Senate effort is going to be another really big focus of this year.
Hopefully we can get Mitch McConnell out of here.
I don't know about that one. That's going to be a tough one.
Or at least, take a little bit of the power away. It's interesting because I'm very involved in politics, and I haven't really heard a whole lot about Cal Cunningham. And I just keep saying, well, maybe it's because I live in a progressive county. So he's not worried about doing a whole lot in Mecklenburg County because it's kind of not a big concern. There's, we have 49 other counties in North Carolina or districts that he has to, engage with. So maybe that's why I haven't heard anything, because I'm like, isn't this like a pivotal Senate race? Because we need to flip the House. We need to flip the Senate.
It is a pivotal Senate race. It will be a very expensive Senate race. I think you're a little early. I think in a month or so, you'll hear more than enough. But right now, I think you have to, for a long time, people thought that the Democratic presidential race was going to suck up all the oxygen until at least June. And it kind of ended way before people thought. And so there's still, that's why I say we're in a little bit of a lull, but don't worry, the North Carolina Senate race will be dramatic enough. I'm sure of it.
I've been getting mailers for the lieutenant governor, and I'm just like, I don't care about that.
You're like, give me the main event.
All right. Thank you so much for your time and coming in and speaking to my audience. I'm sure they're going to find this insightful, and just providing, I want to say an educational, but it's more than that. So thank you for providing the information and giving your time to my audience. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And, commendable what you're doing here and the speakers and all of that. And so shout out to you also.
Thank you. All right.